Chapter 12. The Defence of France, 1814. The Campaign of Military Genius. The year 1814 marked the darkest hour in Napoleon Bonaparte's extraordinary military career, yet it would also showcase his greatest display of tactical brilliance. Like a master chess player facing an inevitable checkmate, Napoleon demonstrated that even in defeat, genius could shine its brightest light. The defence of France in 1814 stands as perhaps the most remarkable example of military leadership under impossible circumstances in all of recorded history. Picture France in early 1814 as a wounded giant surrounded by hungry wolves. After the devastating retreat from Russia and the crushing defeat at Leipzig, Napoleon found himself facing a nightmare scenario that would have broken lesser commanders before the first shot was fired. The great coalition of European powers had finally united with a single purpose: to destroy the French Empire once and for all. From every direction, massive armies converged on French soil like the closing jaws of a gigantic trap. The strategic situation facing Napoleon was so desperate that it seemed almost comical in its hopelessness. From the northeast, the main Allied army of over 200,000 men advanced through Germany under the command of Prince Schwarzenberg. This massive force included Russians, Austrians and Prussians, all burning with the desire for revenge after years of French domination. From the north, another powerful army led by the Prussian general Blücher pushed forward with nearly 100,000 soldiers, their hearts filled with hatred for the man who had humiliated Prussia at Jena and Auerstedt. Meanwhile, in the south, Wellington's experienced British and Spanish forces continued their relentless advance from the Pyrenees, having already crossed into French territory after years of fighting in the Peninsular War. Against this overwhelming tide of enemies, numbering over 350,000 men, Napoleon could muster barely 70,000 troops. These were not the magnificent Grande Armée that had marched to Austerlitz or thundered across the battlefields of Wagram. Instead, Napoleon's forces consisted largely of young conscripts, boys barely old enough to hold a musket, mixed with the remnants of veteran units that had survived the Russian catastrophe. Many of these soldiers had never seen battle, while others were so war-weary that they could barely stand. The contrast between the forces was so stark that neutral observers began placing bets on how quickly Paris would fall rather than whether it would fall at all. The French people themselves had grown tired of endless warfare. After more than 20 years of almost constant fighting, the nation was exhausted. The economy lay in ruins, with trade disrupted and resources depleted. Families had lost fathers, sons and brothers in campaigns from Egypt to Russia. The initial enthusiasm that had carried France through the early revolutionary wars had long since faded, replaced by a grim resignation and growing resentment toward the man whose ambitions seemed to demand endless sacrifice. Even more dangerous for Napoleon was the growing political opposition within his own government and military hierarchy. Many of his marshals, the men who had followed him from Italy to Moscow, began to whisper among themselves about the futility of continued resistance. These were not cowards or traitors, but experienced military professionals who could see that the mathematical odds made victory impossible. Some, like Marshal Marmont, began to consider whether France might be better served by negotiating a separate peace. The loyalty that had once been Napoleon's greatest strength was beginning to crack under the weight of seemingly hopeless circumstances. Yet it was precisely in this moment of supreme crisis that Napoleon's military genius blazed forth with an intensity that amazed both friend and foe. Like a cornered tiger, he became more dangerous than ever before. The emperor who had conquered Europe now faced his greatest test. and he met it with a display of tactical brilliance that military historians still study with awe and wonder. What followed became known as the 6 Days Campaign, a masterpiece of military art that proved that true genius could transcend even the most impossible odds. The key to Napoleon's strategy lay in his masterful use of what military theorists call interior lines. Imagine a wheel with Napoleon at the centre, and his enemies approaching like spokes from different directions. While his enemies had to coordinate their movements across vast distances, Napoleon could strike rapidly at any point on the circumference, concentrate his forces for a decisive blow, then dash away to strike elsewhere before his enemies could react. It was a deadly game of military chess played at lightning speed. On February 10th, 1814, Napoleon struck his first blow at Champaubert. The Allied commanders had made the mistake of dividing their forces, believing that their overwhelming numbers made such concentration unnecessary. Napoleon fell upon an isolated Russian corps like a thunderbolt, completely destroying it in a matter of hours. The young conscripts, who had never seen battle, fought with the fury of veterans. Inspired by the presence of their emperor and the knowledge that they were defending their homeland, the Russians, who had entered the battle confident of easy victory, found themselves shattered and fleeing in panic. But Napoleon was far from finished. Like a master conductor directing a deadly symphony, he immediately pivoted his army toward Montmirail, where another isolated enemy force awaited destruction. The speed of his movement was breathtaking. While the Allied commanders were still trying to understand what had happened at Champaubert, Napoleon was already striking his next blow. At Montmirail, he caught a combined Prussian and Russian force completely off guard. The battle was a masterpiece of tactical coordination, with French infantry, cavalry, and artillery working together like the parts of a perfect machine. By the end of the day, another enemy army had been swept from the field. The psychological impact of these victories rippled through both armies like earthquake shocks. The Allied soldiers, who had been told that Napoleon was finished, suddenly found themselves facing the same terrifying opponent who had crushed their armies at Austerlitz and Jena. Fear began to creep into their ranks, while the French soldiers, who had been demoralized by months of retreat, suddenly remembered what it felt like to win. Napoleon understood the power of morale better than perhaps any commander in history, and he used these victories to rebuild his army's confidence while simultaneously shaking that of his enemies. The campaign continued with devastating efficiency. At Château-Thierry, Napoleon struck another isolated enemy force, this time catching them attempting to cross a river. The French artillery, positioned on commanding heights, turned the crossing into a slaughter. Enemy soldiers fell into the icy water by the hundreds, their screams echoing across the battlefield as Napoleon's guns pounded them without mercy. It was warfare at its most brutal and efficient, conducted by a master who understood that in desperate circumstances there was no room for half measures. The climax of the 6 Days Campaign came at Vauchamp, where Napoleon achieved perhaps his most complete tactical victory of the entire campaign. Catching a Prussian army in the open, he enveloped them with a perfectly executed pincer movement that would have made Alexander or Caesar proud. The Prussians, trapped between converging French columns, fought desperately, but found themselves overwhelmed from all directions. By the battle's end, Blücher's army had lost nearly half its strength and was fleeing in complete disorder toward the Rhine. In just 6 days, Napoleon had transformed a hopeless strategic situation into a series of stunning tactical victories. He had defeated 4 separate enemy armies, inflicting casualties that totaled more than his entire force. The mathematical impossibility of his situation remained unchanged, but he had proven that genius could triumph over numbers when applied with sufficient skill and audacity. Military observers across Europe struggled to comprehend what they had witnessed. How could a man with 70,000 troops defeat enemies numbering in the hundreds of thousands? The answer lay in Napoleon's revolutionary approach to command and control. While his enemies relied on slow, cumbersome communication systems that took days to coordinate movements between distant armies, Napoleon had perfected a system of rapid decision-making and instant execution that allowed him to strike like lightning. His staff officers were trained to anticipate his thoughts and execute his orders with clockwork precision. Every element of his army, from the lowliest private to his most senior general, understood their role in the larger plan and could adapt instantly to changing circumstances. Napoleon's use of the National Guard during this campaign also demonstrated his ability to extract maximum value from limited resources. These part-time soldiers, mostly older men who had served in earlier campaigns, were not expected to face regular enemy troops in open battle. Instead, Napoleon used them to garrison fortresses, guard supply lines, and perform other essential functions that freed up his regular troops for offensive operations. It was a masterful example of resource allocation under extreme pressure. The Emperor also understood that warfare in 1814 was as much about perception as reality. He launched a sophisticated propaganda campaign designed to convince both his own people and his enemies that France remained strong and defiant. Bulletins describing his victories were rushed to Paris and distributed throughout the country, helping to maintain civilian morale at a critical moment. Similarly, he made sure that news of his successes reached enemy commanders, hoping to sow doubt and discord in their ranks. Diplomatically, Napoleon attempted to exploit the natural tensions within the enemy coalition. He understood that while Russia, Prussia, Austria and Britain were united in their desire to defeat him, they had very different ideas about what should happen afterward. Through secret negotiations and carefully planted rumours, he tried to convince individual coalition members that their allies were planning to betray them once victory was achieved. While these efforts ultimately failed, they demonstrated Napoleon's understanding that war was fought on multiple levels simultaneously. However, even military genius has its limits, and the fundamental mathematical reality of Napoleon's situation could not be overcome indefinitely. At the Battle of La Rothière in early February, the crushing weight of enemy numbers finally began to tell. Despite his tactical skill, Napoleon found himself facing an enemy force nearly 4 times the size of his own army. The battle became a grinding contest of attrition, in which French valour and skill were gradually overwhelmed by sheer mass. The fighting at La Rothière was some of the most brutal of the entire campaign. French soldiers, many of them teenagers fighting their first battle, stood their ground against veteran enemy troops with a courage that amazed even their opponents. But courage alone could not overcome such overwhelming odds. As the day wore on, French lines began to bend and break under the relentless pressure. Artillery duels raged across snow-covered fields, turning the white landscape red with blood. By evening, Napoleon was forced to order a withdrawal, his first clear defeat of the campaign. Yet even in defeat, Napoleon's tactical brilliance remained evident. His withdrawal from La Rothière was a masterpiece of military engineering, conducted under extreme pressure with minimal losses. He understood that preserving his army was more important than holding any particular piece of ground, and he managed to extract his forces intact, despite being surrounded by enemies on 3 sides. Lesser commanders might have seen their armies disintegrate under such circumstances, but Napoleon's troops maintained their discipline and cohesion even in retreat. The Battle of Arcis-sur-Aube in March provided perhaps the most dramatic personal moment of the entire campaign. Finding himself once again heavily outnumbered, Napoleon made a decision that revealed both his tactical genius and his personal courage. When enemy artillery fire became particularly intense, targeting the area where the Emperor was directing operations, Napoleon deliberately rode forward into the most dangerous zone. A cannonball landed directly at his horse's feet, covering both horse and rider in mud and debris. For a moment both armies held their breath, expecting to see the Emperor fall. Instead, Napoleon calmly dismounted, brushed the dirt from his uniform, and continued giving orders as if nothing had happened. The psychological impact of this gesture was enormous. French soldiers, seeing their emperor's contempt for death, fought with renewed fury. Enemy troops, witnessing the same scene, were reminded that they faced not just any opponent, but the man who had conquered most of Europe through sheer force of will. The battle continued for hours, with Napoleon personally directing artillery fire and leading cavalry charges despite being vastly outnumbered. As the campaign progressed towards its inevitable conclusion, Napoleon's strategic situation became increasingly desperate. Despite his tactical victories, he could not be everywhere at once, and the sheer size of the enemy forces began to tell. Allied armies that he had defeated would retreat, regroup, and return to battle within days, their losses quickly replaced by fresh reinforcements. Meanwhile, every French casualty was irreplaceable, and Napoleon's army grew smaller with each engagement. The march on Paris represented Napoleon's final gamble. Recognizing that he could not defeat the coalition armies in direct battle, he attempted a brilliant strategic maneuver designed to force his enemies to withdraw by threatening their communications and supply lines. If he could reach Paris before the Allies and rally the garrison there, he might be able to force a negotiated settlement that would preserve at least part of his empire. However, this final roll of the dice failed when the Allied commanders chose to ignore the threat to their rear and instead pushed directly toward the French capital. The fall of Paris in March 1814 marked the effective end of Napoleon's empire, but even this disaster could not diminish the brilliance of his defensive campaign. He had demonstrated that military genius could achieve the impossible, even if it could not ultimately overcome the impossible. The revolt of his marshals represented perhaps the most painful aspect of Napoleon's final defeat. These men had followed him across Europe, sharing in his victories and defeats for more than a decade. Now, faced with the collapse of everything they had built together, they made the agonizing decision to abandon their emperor. Men like Marmont and Ney, who had once sworn to die for Napoleon, now urged him to abdicate for the good of France. Their betrayal was not born of cowardice, but of a realistic assessment that continued resistance would only bring more suffering to the French people. The Treaty of Fontainebleau, signed in April 1814, represented one of the most generous peace settlements in military history. Despite having every reason to treat Napoleon harshly, the Allied powers allowed him to retain his imperial title and granted him sovereignty over the island of Elba. This remarkable clemency reflected not only diplomatic calculation, but also a grudging respect for Napoleon's military genius. Even his enemies recognized that they had defeated a truly extraordinary opponent. Napoleon's exile to Elba was made more painful by the departure of his wife Marie-Louise and their young son to Austria. The Empress, who had never fully embraced her role as Napoleon's consort, chose the security of her father's court over the uncertainty of exile with her husband. This personal abandonment added emotional devastation to political defeat, leaving Napoleon isolated from both his family and his empire. The Six Days Campaign stands as one of the finest examples of tactical excellence under extreme pressure in all of military history. Modern military academies still study Napoleon's movements during this period as a masterclass in the use of interior lines, rapid concentration of forces, and the psychological aspects of command. The campaign demonstrated that numerical superiority, while important, is not always decisive when facing a commander of true genius. Comparing Napoleon's defence of France to other famous defensive campaigns reveals the unique nature of his achievement. Unlike Hannibal's campaigns in Italy or Lee's defence of Virginia, Napoleon was not fighting on familiar territory with reliable local support. Instead, he was defending a war-weary nation against overwhelming odds with an army of mostly inexperienced troops. That he achieved any success at all under such circumstances borders on the miraculous. The leadership Napoleon displayed during this campaign influenced military thinking for generations. His ability to maintain morale and fighting effectiveness despite impossible odds became a model for later commanders facing similar situations. The concept of defeating superior forces through rapid movement and concentrated attacks became a fundamental principle of modern military doctrine, studied and applied by generals from Prussia to Japan. Perhaps most remarkably, Napoleon's performance during the defence of France demonstrated that true military genius transcends mere victory or defeat. While he ultimately lost his empire and was forced into exile, his tactical brilliance during those desperate months earned him a place among history's greatest military commanders. He had proven that skill, courage and determination could achieve the impossible, even if they could not prevent the inevitable. In defeat, Napoleon Bonaparte had achieved a kind of immortality that no mere victory could have provided. The defence of France in 1814 thus stands not as a footnote to Napoleon's career, but as its crowning achievement. In those desperate months, facing impossible odds with inadequate resources, the Emperor demonstrated the true meaning of military genius. He had shown that greatness is not measured solely by success, but by how one responds to adversity. In his finest hour, Napoleon Bonaparte proved that he truly deserved his place among the immortal captains of history. Chapter 13. The 100 Days, 1815. The Final Gamble. The story of Napoleon's return from exile reads like something from an adventure novel, yet every word of it is true. On the small Mediterranean island of Elba, where the great emperor had been banished after his first abdication, Napoleon Bonaparte was plotting what would become history's most famous comeback attempt. The year was 1815, and Europe thought it had seen the last of the man who had shaken the continent for over a decade. Life on Elba had been comfortable enough for an exiled emperor. Napoleon ruled his tiny kingdom of 12,000 inhabitants with the same attention to detail he had once applied to governing half of Europe. He improved roads, reorganized the iron mines, and even designed a new flag for his miniature empire. But comfort was never enough for a man whose mind operated on a continental scale. From his palace windows, Napoleon could see the Italian coast, and beyond that lay France, where troubling news arrived with every ship that docked at Porto Ferraio. The restored Bourbon king, Louis XIV, was proving deeply unpopular with the French people. The old aristocrats who returned with him showed little gratitude to the veterans who had fought for France's glory. Half-pay officers haunted the cafes of Paris, grumbling about their reduced circumstances, while émigrés who had fled during the revolution reclaimed confiscated estates. The peasants, who had bought church lands during the revolution, worried that these purchases might be declared invalid. Most telling of all, the tricolour flag of revolutionary and imperial France had been replaced with the white banner of the Bourbons, a symbol that meant nothing to soldiers who had carried the eagle standards across Europe. Napoleon's spies brought him detailed reports of this growing discontent. They told him of secret societies forming among army officers, of workers singing the Marseillaise in defiance of royal edicts, and of peasants in remote villages who still displayed portraits of their former emperor. Most importantly, they brought word that many of the marshals and generals who had served under Napoleon were growing restless under the new regime. The time seemed right for a desperate gamble. On February 26, 1815, Napoleon made his move. Under cover of darkness, he boarded the brig Inconstant with a force of just over 1,000 men, including 600 soldiers of his old guard and 400 Polish lancers who had refused to abandon their emperor. The British Commissioner on Elba, Sir Neil Campbell, had conveniently sailed to the mainland on personal business, leaving Napoleon free to execute his carefully planned escape. The small flotilla, flying British colours to avoid detection, set sail for the French coast. 3 days later, Napoleon landed at Golfe-Juan, near Cannes, on the Mediterranean coast of France. The local officials, caught completely off guard, could do nothing but watch as the most famous man in Europe stepped back onto French soil. Napoleon had chosen his landing spot carefully. This region had always been friendly to him, and the mountain roads that led inland would allow his small force to avoid the major garrison towns where loyal royal troops might oppose him. What followed was perhaps the most remarkable march in military history. Napoleon had gambled everything on the belief that France would rally to him, and as his tiny army moved north through the Alpine foothills, this gamble began to pay off. At the village of Laffrey, the first real test came. A battalion of royal troops blocked the road, their muskets loaded and ready. Napoleon, showing the theatrical genius that had always been part of his leadership style, stepped forward alone and opened his famous grey overcoat. "Soldiers of the 5th Regiment," he called out, "I am your emperor. Do you not recognize me? If there is one among you who wishes to kill his emperor, here I am." The dramatic gesture worked perfectly. The soldiers, many of whom had served under Napoleon before, threw down their weapons and rushed forward, shouting, "Vive l'Empereur!" Their officers, swept up in the moment, joined the growing procession. This scene repeated itself again and again as Napoleon's march continued. Marshal Ney, who had promised Louis XVI that he would bring Napoleon back to Paris in an iron cage, met his former master near Auxerre. The reunion was emotional and decisive. Ney, known as the bravest of the brave, had been tormented by conflicting loyalties, but when he saw Napoleon again, all his doubts vanished. With tears in his eyes, he embraced the emperor and placed his sword at his service once more. News of Napoleon's landing spread across France like wildfire. In Paris, the royal court tried desperately to organize resistance, but their efforts were half-hearted at best. The army, supposedly loyal to the Bourbon crown, was honeycombed with Napoleonic sympathizers. Entire regiments declared for the emperor without firing a shot. The magic of the name Napoleon proved stronger than all the royal proclamations and threats of punishment. As Napoleon's force swelled from hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands, the march took on the character of a triumphant procession. Veterans limped from their homes to join the growing crowd, many still wearing pieces of their old uniforms. Students from the universities sang revolutionary songs, and workers from the factories cheered until they were hoarse. The eagle, as Napoleon liked to call himself, had indeed landed, and France was remembering what it meant to be proud. The climax came on March 20th, 1815, when Napoleon entered Paris without a battle. Louis XVIII had fled during the night, taking with him the court and what remained of the royal treasury. The Tuileries Palace, which had been Napoleon's home for so many years, opened its doors to welcome back its former master. In just 20 days, Napoleon had transformed himself from an exile with 1,000 followers into the Emperor of France once again. It was a political miracle that stunned Europe and changed the course of history. But Napoleon knew that his bloodless victory in France was only the beginning of his problems. The great powers of Europe had not spent 2 years reorganizing the continent, only to watch their work undone by one man's audacious gamble. Even before Napoleon reached Paris, the Congress of Vienna had declared him an outlaw and enemy of peace. Austria, Russia, Prussia and Britain began mobilizing their armies for what everyone knew would be a final showdown. The strategic situation facing Napoleon in the spring of 1815 was perhaps the most challenging of his entire career. The coalition against him was more united and determined than any he had faced before. The Austrians could field 300,000 men in northern Italy and southern Germany. The Russians were marching 150,000 troops westward across Poland. The Prussians had 120,000 soldiers ready for immediate action. Most immediately threatening, an Anglo-Dutch army of 95,000 men under the Duke of Wellington was assembling in Belgium, just a few days' march from Paris. Against these overwhelming numbers, Napoleon could initially count on perhaps 200,000 men, many of them raw recruits or half-trained National Guardsmen. His experienced veterans numbered no more than 80,000, and even these were scattered across France in various garrisons and depots. Time was his greatest enemy. Every week that passed allowed the coalition to bring more troops to bear, while France's resources remained essentially static. Napoleon's strategic genius showed itself in how he analyzed this seemingly hopeless situation. He recognized that his enemy's greatest strength, their numerical superiority, was also potentially their greatest weakness. The coalition armies were scattered across a wide front, from Belgium to Italy, and they would need time to coordinate their movements. If Napoleon could move fast enough, he might be able to defeat them piecemeal before they could combine their forces. The Emperor decided to stake everything on a lightning campaign against the Anglo-Dutch and Prussian armies in Belgium. These forces, numbering about 200,000 men combined, were his most immediate threat. But they were also separated by a considerable distance. Wellington's army was concentrated around Brussels, while Blucher's Prussians were positioned further east around Namur and Liège. If Napoleon could drive a wedge between these two armies and defeat each in turn, he might shatter the coalition before the Austrian and Russian reinforcements could arrive. This plan required split-second timing and flawless execution. Napoleon would have to concentrate his forces in complete secrecy, cross the Belgian frontier before his enemies realized what was happening, and then win 2 major battles in quick succession. It was an incredibly risky strategy, but it was also the only one that offered any hope of success against such overwhelming odds. The recruitment and organization of Napoleon's army for this campaign revealed both his administrative genius and the practical limitations of his situation. Working 18 hours a day, the Emperor transformed the scattered forces of France into a coherent striking force. Veterans were recalled from half-pay, National Guard units were expanded and retrained, and new regiments were raised from volunteers who flocked to join their returning hero. The enthusiasm was genuine, but enthusiasm alone could not make up for the lack of time and resources. Many of the new recruits had barely learned to march in formation, let alone fight in battle. Equipment was in short supply, with some regiments lacking proper uniforms and others short of muskets. The cavalry, always Napoleon's pride, was particularly weak. The long wars had consumed enormous numbers of horses, and France's breeding stock had not yet recovered. Even more serious was the shortage of experienced officers. Many of the Empire's best generals had been killed or wounded in the campaigns of 1813 and 1814, and those who remained were often assigned to scattered commands across the country. Despite these challenges, Napoleon managed to assemble an army of 124,000 men for the Belgian campaign. The force was organized into 5 corps plus the Imperial Guard, with each corps commanded by officers who had proven themselves in previous campaigns. Marshal Ney took command of the left wing, Marshal Grouchy led the right wing, and Napoleon retained direct control of the reserves, including his beloved Guard. On June 12, 1815, this army began its secret concentration near the Belgian frontier. The movement was executed with remarkable precision, considering the circumstances. French troops marched at night and hid in forests during the day to avoid detection by enemy spies. False rumours were spread to confuse Allied intelligence, while the real destinations were known only to a handful of senior commanders. The deception worked perfectly. When Napoleon's army crossed into Belgium on June 15th, both Wellington and Blücher were caught completely by surprise. The French had achieved the first prerequisite for success, strategic surprise. What followed would determine whether Napoleon could transform this initial advantage into the decisive victory that France desperately needed. The opening moves of the campaign unfolded exactly as Napoleon had planned. His army crossed the Sambre River at Charleroi before dawn on June 15th, driving back the Prussian outposts with barely a shot fired. By noon, French cavalry patrols were pushing deep into Belgian territory, gathering information about enemy positions and spreading confusion among the Allied commanders. Napoleon had successfully driven his wedge between Wellington and Blücher, but now came the crucial test. Could he defeat each enemy army before they could unite against him? The Emperor decided to handle the Prussians first, since they were closer and more immediately threatening. While Marshal Ney advanced toward Quatre Bras to keep Wellington's forces occupied, Napoleon concentrated the bulk of his army against Blücher's position near the village of Ligny. The Battle of Ligny, fought on June 16, 1815, was Napoleon's last tactical victory, and it demonstrated that his military genius remained undiminished despite his recent setbacks. The Prussian army, about 84,000 strong, had taken up a strong defensive position along a series of villages connected by a small stream. Blücher, the aggressive old field marshal known as Marshal Forward, was confident that his experienced troops could hold their ground until Wellington arrived to support them. Napoleon, with about 68,000 men, faced the challenging task of attacking a prepared enemy position with inferior numbers. His solution was a masterpiece of tactical coordination. While his corps commanders launched attacks against the Prussian flanks, Napoleon concentrated his artillery and reserves for a devastating assault against the enemy centre at Ligny village itself. The battle raged throughout the afternoon with an intensity that reminded veterans of the great contests of previous campaigns. Prussian infantry, formed in their traditional solid squares, traded volleys with French columns that advanced with the old revolutionary élan. Artillery thundered from both sides, turning the peaceful farming villages into scenes of devastation. Napoleon himself moved constantly along the battle line, appearing wherever the fighting was fiercest to encourage his men and direct the action. The decisive moment came as evening approached. Napoleon launched his Imperial Guard in a carefully timed assault that broke through the Prussian centre just as his cavalry struck their flank. Blücher himself was knocked unconscious when his horse was shot from under him, and only the quick thinking of his subordinates saved the old marshal from capture. The Prussian army, its centre shattered and its commander out of action, began a fighting withdrawal that soon turned into a general retreat. Ligny was a clear French victory, but it was not the annihilating triumph that Napoleon needed. The Prussians had lost about 16,000 casualties and 21 guns, but their army remained intact as a fighting force. More importantly, they retreated not eastward toward their supply bases, as Napoleon expected, but northward toward Wavre, keeping them in contact with Wellington's forces. This would prove to be a fatal development for French hopes. Meanwhile, at Quatre Bras, Marshal Ney was supposed to be preventing Wellington from reinforcing the Prussians. Instead, the battle that developed there on June 16th became a confused affair that satisfied neither side. Ney, normally one of Napoleon's most reliable subordinates, seemed to lose his usual decisiveness. He launched piecemeal attacks against strong British positions without proper reconnaissance or coordination. The Battle of Quatre Bras revealed several ominous signs for the French cause. Wellington's Anglo-Dutch army showed the same steady discipline that had defeated French forces in Spain, while some of Napoleon's subordinate commanders displayed a disturbing lack of the energy and precision that had characterized their earlier campaigns. Most critically, communication between different parts of the French army began to break down at crucial moments. Napoleon had sent urgent orders for one of his corps to march from Ligny to support Ney's attack at Quatre Bras. But these orders were delayed, misunderstood, and finally countermanded in a series of administrative failures that would have been unthinkable during the Empire's great days. The Corps spent the entire day marching back and forth between the two battlefields without fighting effectively in either engagement. These communication failures reflected deeper problems in Napoleon's hastily assembled army. The staff system that had functioned so smoothly during previous campaigns was now undermanned and disorganized. Many of the experienced staff officers who had managed the complex logistics of earlier wars were either dead, retired, or serving the Bourbon government. Their replacements, however willing, lacked the years of experience needed to handle the intricate coordination that Napoleonic warfare required. After the battles of June 16th, Napoleon faced a crucial decision. He had defeated Blücher, but not destroyed him, while Wellington remained unbeaten at Quatre Bras. The Emperor could pursue the retreating Prussians and try to finish them off, or he could concentrate everything against Wellington before the two Allied armies could unite. Napoleon chose the latter course, believing that the Prussians were more seriously damaged than they actually were, and that he had time to deal with Wellington before Blücher could recover. This decision led directly to the Battle of Waterloo, fought on June 18, 1815, which would become the most famous defeat in military history. Wellington had withdrawn his army to a defensive position on the ridge of Mont Saint-Jean, just south of the village of Waterloo. The position was well chosen, with a reverse slope that concealed most of the Allied troops from French observation and artillery fire. Napoleon arrived at the battlefield early on the morning of June 18th with about 72,000 men and 246 guns. Wellington's army, reinforced during the night, numbered about 68,000 with 156 guns. On paper, the forces were evenly matched, but appearances were deceiving. Wellington's army included some of the finest troops in Europe, including British veterans of the Peninsular Campaign, while Napoleon's force contained many inexperienced conscripts fighting their first major battle. The battle that followed has been analysed more thoroughly than perhaps any other single engagement in military history. Yet it remains a subject of debate among historians and military experts. What is clear is that Napoleon made several crucial errors that cost him his last chance at victory and changed the course of European history. The first mistake was the late start. Heavy rain had fallen during the night, turning the battlefield into a muddy quagmire that made movement difficult for both infantry and cavalry. Napoleon decided to wait until the ground dried somewhat before beginning his attack, but this delay proved fatal. Every hour that passed brought Blucher's Prussian army closer to the battlefield, and by the time the French attack finally began at 11:30 a.m., the window for victory was already closing. Napoleon's battle plan was relatively straightforward but fatally flawed. He intended to pin down Wellington's centre with artillery bombardment and infantry attacks, while using his cavalry to exploit any gaps that appeared in the Allied line. The plan might have worked against a less experienced opponent, but Wellington had fought too many battles to be deceived by such straightforward tactics. The battle opened with a massive French artillery bombardment designed to soften the Allied defences. For over an hour, Napoleon's guns poured shot and shell into Wellington's positions, creating an impressive spectacle but achieving limited results. Most of the Allied infantry was sheltered behind the reverse slope of the ridge, protected from direct fire, while the muddy ground absorbed much of the impact from artillery rounds that would have been devastating on harder terrain. When the French infantry finally advanced, they moved forward with impressive courage but insufficient tactical flexibility. The attacking columns, formed in the traditional manner that had served Napoleon so well in earlier campaigns, found themselves facing British infantry deployed in two deep lines that could bring far more muskets to bear. The mathematical advantage of the British formation, combined with their superior training and discipline, resulted in devastating volleys that shattered French attack after attack. The most famous incident of the battle came when Marshal Ney launched a massive cavalry charge against the Allied centre. Nearly 5,000 French horsemen, the flower of Napoleon's mounted arm, thundered up the slope toward Wellington's guns. It was a magnificent spectacle that epitomised the glory and futility of Napoleonic warfare. The cavalry reached the Allied artillery positions and overran several batteries, but they could not break the British infantry squares that formed the backbone of Wellington's defence. British infantry, trained to perfection in the techniques of fighting cavalry, formed squares with their bayonets pointing outward like giant hedgehogs. The French horsemen circled these formations like waves breaking against rocks, unable to make any impression on the disciplined ranks within. Without infantry support to exploit their initial success, the cavalry charges accomplished nothing except to exhaust the horses and reduce French strength for the climactic struggle that everyone knew was coming. As the afternoon wore on, the sound of distant gunfire announced the arrival of Blucher's Prussians on the French right flank, Napoleon was forced to detach increasing numbers of troops to contain this new threat, weakening his attacks against Wellington's main position. The two-front battle that the Emperor had hoped to avoid was now reality, and French resources were stretched to the breaking point. The final crisis came around 7 p.m. when Napoleon decided to commit his last reserve, the Imperial Guard, in a desperate attempt to break Wellington's line before the Prussians could arrive in force. These were the men who had never retreated, the elite of the elite, who had followed their emperor across Europe and through countless victories. If anyone could save the day, it would be the Guard. The attack began with magnificent precision. 5 battalions of the Middle Guard, about 3,000 men, advanced up the slope in perfect formation, despite the mud and the continuous artillery fire. Their blue uniforms and tall bearskin caps made them instantly recognizable, and a murmur ran through both armies as these legendary troops moved into action. For a moment, it seemed as though the old magic might work once more. But Wellington had saved his best troops for this moment. The first Foot Guards, lying concealed behind a low ridge, suddenly stood up and delivered a crushing volley at point-blank range. The surprise was complete and devastating. The leading battalions of the Middle Guard, men who had never known defeat, staggered and began to fall back. The sight of the Imperial Guard in retreat sent shockwaves through the entire French army. La Garde recule! The Guard retreats! The cry spread along the French lines with the speed of wildfire. For soldiers who had been taught that the Guard was invincible, seeing these elite troops in disorder was proof that the battle was lost. What had been an orderly withdrawal in some sectors became a general panic as entire regiments broke and ran for the rear. Napoleon himself tried desperately to rally his men, riding among the fleeing soldiers and shouting that victory was still possible. Some units of the Guard formed squares and continued fighting with magnificent courage, their officers reportedly crying, "La Garde meurt mais ne se rend pas." The Guard dies but does not surrender. But individual heroism could not reverse the tide of battle. The Prussians were arriving in overwhelming numbers, Wellington's entire line was advancing, and the French army was disintegrating. By 9 p.m. the Battle of Waterloo was over. Napoleon's army had ceased to exist as an organized force. The Emperor himself barely escaped capture, abandoning his carriage and most of his personal effects as he fled the field with a small escort of cavalry. Behind him lay not just a defeated army, but the wreckage of all his hopes for restored glory. The aftermath of Waterloo was swift and decisive. Napoleon reached Paris on June 21st to find that his political support had evaporated as completely as his military strength. The Chamber of Deputies, which had welcomed him enthusiastically 3 months earlier, now demanded his abdication. Even his most loyal supporters realized that continuing the war would only bring foreign occupation and civil conflict to France. Napoleon's final political manoeuvring showed the same mixture of brilliance and miscalculation that had characterized his military career. He tried to abdicate in favor of his son, hoping to preserve the dynasty even if he could not save his own throne. When this failed, he considered fleeing to America to begin life as a private citizen in the New World. But time was running out. Allied armies were converging on Paris, and the provisional government was eager to make peace before the capital suffered the fate of other cities that had resisted Napoleon. On June 22, 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte abdicated for the second and final time. The document was brief and dignified, expressing his willingness to sacrifice himself for the welfare of France. It was the end of an era that had lasted for 25 years and changed the world forever. Rather than face the uncertain mercy of the restored Bourbon government, Napoleon decided to surrender to the British. He travelled to the port of Rochefort, where HMS Bellerophon was waiting offshore. In a letter to the Prince Regent of England, Napoleon wrote one of the most famous passages in diplomatic history. "I come, like Themistocles, to throw myself on the hospitality of the British people. I put myself under the protection of their laws, which I claim from your Royal Highness as the most powerful, the most constant, and the most generous of my enemies." It was a magnificent gesture, worthy of the man who had dominated European politics for so long. But the British government, while treating Napoleon with personal courtesy, had no intention of allowing him to remain where he might again become a focal point for French opposition to the restored monarchy. After some deliberation, they decided to exile him to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, a place so isolated that escape would be impossible and outside interference unlikely. The Waterloo campaign had lasted exactly 100 days from Napoleon's return to Paris until his final abdication. In that brief span he had demonstrated both the heights of political genius and the depths of military miscalculation. His bloodless reconquest of France proved that his understanding of popular psychology remained as acute as ever, but his handling of the Belgian campaign showed that even the greatest military minds could make fatal errors when time and resources were insufficient. The case study of Waterloo reveals several interconnected factors that contributed to Napoleon's defeat. At the tactical level, his decision to delay the morning attack proved crucial, as did his failure to coordinate properly with his subordinate commanders. The weather, which had seemed like a minor inconvenience, turned out to affect everything from artillery effectiveness to cavalry mobility. Most importantly, Napoleon's strategic assumptions proved incorrect. He had gambled that he could defeat Wellington before the Prussians arrived, but Blücher's army recovered from Ligny faster than expected and marched to the sound of the guns with determination that caught the French completely off guard. Yet even with all these factors working against him, Napoleon came remarkably close to victory. Had the Imperial Guard's attack succeeded, or had the Prussians been delayed by even 2 hours, the outcome might have been entirely different. The margin between triumph and disaster in the Waterloo campaign was measured in minutes and hundreds of yards, demonstrating how the greatest military operations can turn on the smallest details. The 100 days had ended, but the legend of Napoleon Bonaparte was just beginning to take the shape that would influence European politics for generations to come. Chapter 14. The St. Helena years, 1815 to 1821. Exile and legend. Creation the ship, HMS. Northumberland cut through the grey waters of the South Atlantic in October 1815, carrying the most famous prisoner in the world toward his final exile. On deck, wrapped in his familiar grey overcoat, Napoleon Bonaparte gazed at the endless horizon and contemplated the strange turn his life had taken. Just 4 months earlier he had been Emperor of the French, commander of armies and master of millions. Now he was simply General Bonaparte, a title grudgingly accorded by his British captors, sailing toward a volcanic island that most Europeans had never heard of. St. Helena was chosen precisely because of its isolation. Located 1,200 miles from the nearest land, this tiny speck of rock and vegetation in the South Atlantic seemed like the perfect prison for a man whose genius lay in inspiring others to follow him. The island was only 10 miles long and 6 miles wide, surrounded by treacherous currents and towering cliffs that made escape virtually impossible. A British garrison of 2,800 men would ensure that Napoleon's exile remained permanent. The man who stepped ashore at Jamestown on October 15, 1815, was 46 years old, but looked older. The stresses of the past 2 years had aged him noticeably, and he had grown corpulent during his comfortable captivity on Elba. Yet his eyes still held the penetrating intelligence that had made him master of Europe, and his presence still commanded respect even from his captors. Napoleon's new home was Longwood House, a rambling structure that had originally been built as quarters for the island's lieutenant governor. The house was damp, poorly constructed, and entirely inadequate for someone of Napoleon's former status, but it would be his world for the next 6 years. The British had made some efforts to make it habitable, but comfort was clearly not their primary concern. What mattered was security. The daily routine that Napoleon established at Longwood revealed both his extraordinary mental discipline and his struggle to find purpose in his reduced circumstances. He rose late, often not appearing until noon, and spent hours dictating his memoirs to the small circle of faithful followers who had chosen to share his exile. These men, including the devoted Lasquisse General Gourgaud and General Montholon, served as both companions and secretaries in the enormous task of recording Napoleon's version of his remarkable career. The dictation sessions were the highlight of Napoleon's day and the foundation of his lasting influence on history. Working from memory, with only a few books and documents for reference, he recreated the campaigns and decisions that had shaped Europe. His recall was phenomenal, extending to minute details of battles fought decades earlier, diplomatic conversations, and the personalities of hundreds of individuals who had played roles in his story. But these were not simple reminiscences. Napoleon approached the task of writing his memoirs with the same strategic thinking he had once applied to military campaigns. He understood that this would be his final battle, fought not with cannons and cavalry, but with words and ideas. The British might have imprisoned his body, but his mind remained free to wage war for his historical reputation. The Napoleon who emerged from these dictated memoirs was subtly but significantly different from the historical figure who had actually ruled Europe. The harsh realities of absolute power were softened, the mistakes minimized, and the motivations elevated. Most importantly, Napoleon systematically portrayed himself as a champion of liberal principles and European unity, concepts that had played little role in his actual policies but would prove enormously appealing to future generations. This process of legend creation was perhaps Napoleon's most successful campaign. He presented himself as a man ahead of his time, defeated not by his own errors, but by the short-sightedness of monarchs who could not understand his vision of a united, progressive Europe. The wars that had cost millions of lives were recast as struggles for national liberation and constitutional government. The Continental System, which had brought economic hardship to much of Europe, became an early attempt at European economic integration. The irony was that many of these claims contained kernels of truth. Napoleon had indeed introduced legal codes, administrative reforms and educational systems that outlasted his empire. He had promoted men based on merit rather than birth, and his influence had accelerated the breakdown of feudal systems across the continent. By emphasizing these achievements while downplaying his more autocratic tendencies, Napoleon created a historical persona that would inspire liberal and nationalist movements throughout the 19th century. The relationship between Napoleon and his British captors was complex and often tense. Sir Hudson Lowe, the governor appointed to oversee his captivity, was a conscientious but inflexible officer who took his responsibilities seriously. Lowe insisted on the restrictions imposed by the British government, including limits on Napoleon's movements around the island and supervision of his correspondence. These measures, while understandable from a security perspective, created constant friction with a prisoner accustomed to absolute authority. Napoleon's response to these restrictions revealed both his political cunning and his genuine frustration. He complained bitterly about every perceived slight, turning minor inconveniences into major diplomatic incidents that embarrassed the British government. His protests found sympathetic audiences in European liberal circles, where many people began to view him as a martyr to reactionary politics rather than a defeated despot. The emperor's health began to decline noticeably during his third year on St. Helena. He suffered from stomach pains, nausea, and a general weakness that his physicians struggled to diagnose. The island's climate, alternately hot and damp, did not suit his constitution, and the enforced inactivity was torture for a man accustomed to constant mental and physical stimulation. He gained weight, lost much of his hair, and developed the sallow complexion that would characterize his final years. Despite his physical decline, Napoleon's intellectual activities continued with remarkable intensity. He read voraciously, consuming everything from classical literature to contemporary newspapers when the British authorities allowed them. His library at Longwood eventually contained over 3,000 volumes, covering subjects from military history to botany. He maintained an active correspondence with supporters in Europe, though all letters were subject to British censorship. The dictation of memoirs continued almost daily, with Napoleon displaying an extraordinary ability to recall and analyze events from his past. These sessions revealed his profound understanding of military principles and his gift for explaining complex strategic concepts in clear, memorable language. Many of the maxims and observations he formulated during these years would later become standard doctrine in military academies around the world. Napoleon's analysis of his past campaigns showed both remarkable objectivity and understandable self-justification. He could discuss his tactical errors at Waterloo with clinical precision, while simultaneously arguing that the strategic situation had made defeat almost inevitable. His assessment of subordinates was often harsh, but usually accurate, and his observations about the nature of leadership and the psychology of command reflected decades of practical experience at the highest levels. The creation of the Napoleonic legend was aided immeasurably by the Romantic movement that was transforming European culture during these years. Writers and artists, particularly those with liberal sympathies, found in the exiled emperor a perfect symbol of individual genius struggling against conventional authority. Lord Byron's poems about Napoleon captured the imagination of educated Europeans, while painters created dramatic images of the emperor in exile that emphasized his tragic grandeur rather than his political failures. This romanticization of Napoleon was facilitated by the distance and isolation of St. Helena. Few Europeans ever saw the aging, overweight figure who spent his days dictating memoirs and arguing with British officials. Instead, they remembered the dynamic young general who had conquered most of Europe, or they imagined him as Byron described, a Promethean figure chained to his rock but unbroken in spirit. The gradual transformation of Napoleon from defeated emperor to romantic hero was one of the most successful image rehabilitation campaigns in history. Within a decade of Waterloo, many Europeans who had suffered under his rule were beginning to remember him with nostalgia. His emphasis on merit over birth, his legal and administrative reforms, and his role in breaking down the old feudal order began to seem more important than the wars and dictatorial aspects of his rule. Napoleon's relationships with his fellow exiles provided both companionship and frustration during his years on St. Helena. Las Cases, his most devoted follower, served as the primary recorder of his memoirs until he was expelled from the island by British authorities in 1816. The general had become too effective at smuggling Napoleon's propaganda to Europe, and Governor Low decided he was more dangerous than useful as a companion for the prisoner. The departure of Las Cases was a severe blow to Napoleon's morale and his memoir project. The remaining companions, while loyal, lacked Las Cases' literary skills and political sophistication. Quarrels began to develop within the small circle as the boredom and isolation took their toll. General Gourgaud, jealous of his access to the emperor, clashed repeatedly with General Montholon, who had brought his wife and children to share the exile. These personal conflicts revealed Napoleon's continued ability to dominate those around him, even in captivity. He played his followers against each other with the same skill he had once used to manage his marshals and ministers. Yet there was something pathetic about these intrigues conducted within the narrow confines of Longwood House, a pale shadow of the grand political manoeuvring that had once determined the fate of nations. The slow deterioration of Napoleon's health became a source of increasing concern and controversy. His British physicians diagnosed various ailments but could not agree on the underlying cause of his decline. Napoleon himself suspected that he was being slowly poisoned, a theory that found ready believers among his supporters but was almost certainly false. The more likely explanation was that he suffered from stomach cancer, the same disease that had killed his father. As his condition worsened, Napoleon began to make preparations for death with the same attention to detail he had once applied to military campaigns. He drafted several versions of his will, distributing his few remaining possessions among his followers and making provision for his son, the Duke of Reichstadt, who lived as a virtual prisoner at the Austrian court. Most importantly, he used his final months to complete his political testament, summarizing the principles and achievements he hoped would define his historical legacy. The end came on May 5, 1821, during a fierce storm that lashed St. Helena with winds and rain. Napoleon died in his bed at Longwood House, surrounded by his remaining companions and the British officials who had supervised his captivity. His last words, according to those present, were "France, Army, Head of the Army, Josephine," a fitting summary of the three great passions of his life. The death of Napoleon Bonaparte at age 51 sent shock waves across Europe. Even his former enemies acknowledged that a giant had passed from the stage of history. The British treated his remains with considerable respect, providing a military funeral and allowing him to be buried in a peaceful valley on St. Helena, according to his wishes. The funeral procession included both British officers and Napoleon's French companions, a symbolic recognition that death had finally ended the enmities that had divided them in life. The immediate controversy surrounding Napoleon's death focused on its cause. His followers insisted that he had been murdered either through deliberate poisoning or medical negligence by his British captors. Modern analysis of hair samples has detected traces of arsenic, but this was likely due to the wallpaper and medications common in that era, rather than deliberate poisoning. The medical evidence strongly suggests that Napoleon died of stomach cancer, possibly aggravated by the stress and poor diet of his final years. More important than the medical details was the political impact of Napoleon's death. Across Europe, his passing marked the definitive end of an era that had begun with the French Revolution and continued through 25 years of almost constant warfare. The conservative monarchies that had defeated him could finally relax their vigilance, secure in the knowledge that the most dangerous revolutionary of his generation was gone forever. Yet even in death, Napoleon continued to influence European politics in ways his enemies had not anticipated. The memoirs and writings he had produced during his exile began circulating widely, offering a romanticized version of his career that emphasized his progressive achievements while minimizing his autocratic methods. These works became foundational texts for liberal and nationalist movements across the continent, inspiring a generation of revolutionaries who saw Napoleon as a champion of popular sovereignty against aristocratic privilege. The legend that Napoleon had so carefully constructed during his St. Helena years proved to have remarkable staying power. His presentation of himself as a defender of the revolution's ideals against reactionary coalitions resonated with Europeans who were growing increasingly dissatisfied with the conservative order established after 1815. The very isolation that had been intended to neutralize his influence instead gave him the time and freedom to reshape his historical image without interference from contemporary critics. The case study of Napoleon's legend creation versus historical reality reveals the extraordinary power of skilled propaganda and the human tendency to romanticize the past. The Napoleon of the St. Helena memoirs was a more attractive figure than the historical emperor had often been, emphasizing his role as a modernizer and European unifier while downplaying his wars of conquest and authoritarian rule. This selective memory became so influential that even serious historians struggle to separate the man from the myth. The process by which Napoleon transformed himself from defeated dictator to romantic hero illustrates several important principles about historical memory and political legend-making. First, distance and time tend to soften harsh judgments, allowing positive achievements to overshadow negative aspects of a leader's record. Second, the absence of contemporary contradictory voices gave Napoleon unusual freedom to present his own version of events without challenge. Finally, the changing political climate of post-1815 Europe made his liberal rhetoric more appealing than it had been during his actual reign. The comparison between Napoleon's exile accounts and contemporary evidence reveals significant discrepancies in several key areas. His claims about consistently supporting constitutional government throughout his career were contradicted by his actual establishment of personal dictatorship and his suppression of legislative bodies when they opposed his policies. His presentation of the Continental System as an early form of European economic integration ignored its coercive nature and the economic hardship it caused to ordinary people across the continent. Similarly, Napoleon's portrayal of his military campaigns as wars of liberation clashed with the historical record of occupation, requisitions, and the imposition of French puppet governments throughout Europe. While he had indeed introduced legal and administrative reforms in conquered territories, these were implemented to serve French interests rather than from any consistent commitment to human rights or national self-determination. Yet the power of the Napoleonic legend was not based entirely on fiction. Many of his claims about modernization and merit-based advancement were substantially accurate, and his influence on European development was genuinely transformative. The civil code, the reorganization of education, and the careers open to talent were real achievements that had lasting positive effects. The legend succeeded because it contained enough truth to be credible while emphasizing the aspects of his record that appealed to contemporary sensibilities. The impact of Napoleon's carefully crafted historical image extended far beyond academic debates about his place in history. Throughout the 19th century, his legend inspired liberal revolutions, nationalist movements, and democratic reforms across Europe and beyond. The man who had actually suppressed representative government in France became a symbol of popular sovereignty against aristocratic privilege. The emperor who had imposed French hegemony over Europe was remembered as a champion of national self-determination. This transformation reached its culmination in 1840, when the French government of Louis Philippe arranged for Napoleon's remains to be returned from St. Helena to Paris. The elaborate ceremony that accompanied the repatriation of his body demonstrated how completely the legend had triumphed over historical memory. Millions of French citizens lined the streets to honour the man who had led them to glory and disaster, remembering only the glory and forgetting the cost. The funeral procession from the port of Le Havre to the Invalides in Paris became one of the great spectacles of the 19th century. Veterans of the Grande Armée, now old men, wept openly as the hearse passed. Students sang the Marseillaise and other revolutionary songs that had been banned under the Bourbon Restoration. The pageantry deliberately evoked the empire at its height, with elaborate uniforms, military bands, and ceremonial cannon that reminded spectators of Napoleon's greatest victories while ignoring his ultimate defeat. The final resting place chosen for Napoleon's remains was itself a masterpiece of political symbolism. The tomb in the Invalides, beneath the golden dome that dominates the Paris skyline, was designed to inspire awe and reverence. Visitors must descend to view the sarcophagus, creating the impression of paying homage to a fallen god rather than visiting the grave of a political leader. The inscriptions surrounding the tomb emphasize his achievements in law, administration, and public works, while making no mention of the wars that dominated his career. This physical memorial became the focal point for the continued evolution of the Napoleonic legend throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Each generation found in Napoleon's story elements that resonated with their own concerns and aspirations. Republicans emphasized his rise from obscurity through merit and talent. Nationalists celebrated his role in spreading ideas about popular sovereignty and national self-determination. Even socialists found inspiration in his attacks on aristocratic privilege and his creation of career opportunities for common people. The durability of Napoleon's self-created legend demonstrates the power of skillful historical interpretation and the human tendency to prefer inspiring myths to complex realities. The 6 years he spent on St. Helena, dictating memoirs and crafting his historical image, may have been more influential than any of his military campaigns. Through words rather than weapons, he achieved a kind of immortality that has survived changes in political systems, ideologies, and historical fashions. The St. Helena years also revealed aspects of Napoleon's character that had been obscured during his years of power. His intellectual curiosity, his capacity for self-reflection, and his genuine concern for his historical reputation showed a more complex personality than the simple military genius of popular imagination. Even his critics had to acknowledge the breadth of his knowledge and the sophistication of his analysis of European politics and military affairs. Perhaps most remarkably, Napoleon's exile writings demonstrated that his strategic thinking remained as sharp as ever, even in defeat and captivity. His analysis of future European developments proved remarkably prescient, anticipating many of the political and economic trends that would shape the continent throughout the 19th century. His predictions about the eventual unification of Germany, the decline of the Ottoman Empire, and the rise of popular nationalism were borne out by subsequent events. The contrast between Napoleon's actual circumstances during his final years and the grandeur of the legend he created illustrates the triumph of imagination over reality. The aging, sick man, arguing with British officials about his daily routine, had somehow transformed himself into a romantic hero whose influence would inspire revolutionaries and reformers for generations. It was perhaps the greatest victory of his career, achieved not through military conquest, but through the power of carefully crafted words and the appeal of a compelling personal story. The legacy of the St. Helena years extends far beyond Napoleon's personal reputation to encompass broader questions about historical memory, political legitimacy, and the relationship between power and propaganda. His success in reshaping his own historical image demonstrated that the battle for historical interpretation could be as important as military victories in determining a leader's lasting influence. The techniques he developed for legend-making would be studied and imitated by political figures throughout the modern era. When Napoleon Bonaparte died on that stormy night in May 1821, he left behind more than just the physical remains that would eventually rest in the Invalides. He had created a political and cultural legacy that would outlive all the monarchies that had combined to defeat him. The emperor was dead, but the legend was immortal, ready to inspire new generations of Europeans who dreamed of glory, reform, and the triumph of merit over privilege. In his final campaign, fought with words rather than weapons, Napoleon had achieved perhaps his most complete and lasting victory. Chapter 15. Military Legacy and Innovation. The sun was setting over the battlefield of Austerlitz on December 2, 1805, casting long shadows across the frozen ground where Napoleon had just achieved one of history's most brilliant victories. As the young emperor surveyed the field where his Grande Armée had crushed the combined forces of Austria and Russia, he could hardly have imagined that the revolutionary principles he had employed would echo through military corridors for centuries to come. The genius of Napoleon Bonaparte extended far beyond his ability to win battles. He fundamentally transformed the very nature of warfare itself, creating innovations that would influence military thinking well into the modern era. When Napoleon first took command of the Army of Italy in 1796, he inherited military traditions that had remained largely unchanged for decades. European armies moved like lumbering giants, bound by rigid formations and predictable tactics that often reduced warfare to elaborate ceremonies of mutual destruction. The young Corsican general looked upon these ancient methods with the eye of a revolutionary, seeing not tradition but opportunity for transformation. His first innovation came in the realm of artillery, where he recognized that cannons were not merely defensive weapons to be spread thinly along battle lines, but powerful offensive tools that could be concentrated to devastating effect. The principle of artillery concentration became the cornerstone of Napoleonic tactics. Rather than distributing his cannons evenly across his front, as previous commanders had done, Napoleon would mass his artillery at crucial points, creating what he called his Grand Battery. At the Battle of Wagram in 1809, he assembled over 100 cannons in a single devastating formation that punched through the Austrian centre like a thunderbolt. This concentration of firepower required new approaches to mobility, leading Napoleon to develop horse artillery units that could gallop across battlefields and deploy rapidly wherever they were needed most. These mobile artillery tactics revolutionized warfare by making artillery an active, dynamic force rather than a static defensive element. The genius of Napoleon's combined arms coordination lay not merely in using infantry, cavalry and artillery together, but in orchestrating them like a master conductor directing a symphony. Each arm of his forces supported and amplified the effectiveness of the others in ways that previous generations of military commanders had never achieved. His infantry would advance in flexible columns that could quickly deploy into lines for firepower or squares for defense against cavalry. Meanwhile, his artillery would pound enemy positions to create gaps that his cavalry could exploit, while his cavalry protected his artillery from enemy charges and pursued broken enemy formations to prevent their reorganization. This coordination required revolutionary changes in military formations and deployment. Napoleon abandoned the rigid linear tactics that had dominated European battlefields since the days of Frederick the Great, instead employing flexible formations that could adapt to changing battlefield conditions. His infantry moved in mixed order, combining the mobility of columns with the firepower of lines, switching between formations as circumstances demanded. This flexibility allowed his forces to concentrate rapidly at decisive points, while maintaining the ability to spread out and avoid concentrated enemy fire when necessary. The personal leadership style that Napoleon brought to warfare represented another revolutionary innovation. Unlike the aristocratic generals of the old regime who commanded from the rear and rarely showed themselves to their troops, Napoleon led from the front, sharing the dangers and hardships of his soldiers. He knew thousands of his men by name, remembered their service records, and promoted based on merit rather than birth. This created an unprecedented bond between commander and troops that translated into extraordinary morale and fighting effectiveness. His soldiers would march further, fight harder, and endure greater hardships than any army in European history because they believed in their emperor and knew he believed in them. Napoleon's strategic principles revolutionized military thinking by demonstrating how speed and concentration could overcome superior numbers. His famous maxim, "March divided, fight united," became the foundation of modern military doctrine. By dividing his forces during the approach march, he could confuse his enemies about his true intentions while covering more ground and living off the land more easily. Then, through superior staff work and rapid movement, he could concentrate his scattered forces at the decisive point faster than his enemies could react. This principle was brilliantly demonstrated during the 1805 campaign leading to Austerlitz, where Napoleon scattered his corps across Central Europe before concentrating them with lightning speed to destroy the Allied army. The concept of interior lines became another hallmark of Napoleonic strategy. By positioning his forces between separated enemy armies, Napoleon could use shorter distances to concentrate against one enemy force before the others could arrive to support it. This geometric advantage allowed him to fight enemies piecemeal even when they outnumbered him overall. During the 1814 campaign in France, facing overwhelming odds as Allied armies converged on Paris from multiple directions, Napoleon used interior lines to win a series of brilliant victories against superior forces by hitting each enemy army before they could coordinate their movements. Napoleon understood that warfare in the modern age extended beyond the battlefield to encompass entire economies and societies. His practice of economic warfare, most notably through the Continental System, demonstrated how military and economic pressure could be combined to achieve strategic objectives. By attempting to exclude British goods from European markets, he sought to use France's military dominance to achieve economic victory over his most persistent enemy. Though ultimately unsuccessful, this approach foreshadowed the total economic warfare that would characterize conflicts in the 20th century. The integration of diplomatic and military action represented another Napoleonic innovation that influenced warfare for generations. Napoleon understood that military victories were meaningless unless they achieved political objectives, and he used his battlefield successes as tools of diplomacy while employing diplomatic negotiations to improve his military position. His ability to separate his enemies through diplomatic means while concentrating military force against isolated opponents became a model for strategic thinking that extended far beyond his own era. The organizational revolution that Napoleon brought to military affairs proved as important as his tactical innovations. The core system he developed created independent combined arms units that could operate separately while supporting the overall strategic plan. Each corps contained infantry, cavalry, artillery and support services, making it capable of independent action while remaining part of the larger army. This organizational structure provided unprecedented flexibility and speed of operation while reducing the command burden on the army commander. The core system became the foundation of military organization for virtually every army in the world and remains the basis of modern military structure. Napoleon's staff system revolutionized military communication and coordination. His general staff, trained at the École Militaire and other military schools, provided professional expertise that enabled complex operations involving multiple corps across vast distances. These staff officers could translate Napoleon's strategic vision into detailed operational orders, while providing the administrative support necessary for rapid movement and supply. The Napoleonic staff system became the model for military organization worldwide and established the principle of professional military education that dominates modern armies. The merit-based promotion system that Napoleon instituted broke centuries of aristocratic privilege in military service. His famous declaration that every soldier carried a marshal's baton in his knapsack opened military leadership to talent regardless of birth or social position. This meritocratic approach not only improved the quality of French military leadership, but also created unprecedented motivation among the ranks, as soldiers knew that exceptional service could lead to advancement and recognition. Many of Napoleon's most successful generals, including Murat, Ney and Lannes, rose from humble origins to achieve the highest military honours through their battlefield performance. The influence of Napoleonic warfare on later military thought cannot be overstated. Karl von Clausewitz, the Prussian military theorist who fought against Napoleon and witnessed his methods firsthand, built his monumental work on war around analysis of Napoleonic campaigns. Clausewitz's concepts of the fog of war, the culminating point of victory, and the political nature of warfare all emerged from his study of Napoleon's methods. Through Clausewitz's writings, Napoleonic principles became embedded in military education curricula throughout Europe and America, influencing generations of military leaders who never fought in the Napoleonic Wars. The American Civil War provided a dramatic demonstration of Napoleonic principles applied to industrial age warfare. Generals like Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman studied Napoleonic campaigns and applied his principles of concentration, interior lines and economic warfare to the American conflict. Sherman's march through Georgia reflected Napoleon's understanding that destroying an enemy's economic base could be as important as defeating his armies, while Grant's coordinated campaigns across multiple theaters demonstrated the Napoleonic principle of unified strategic direction. Modern combined arms doctrine traces its origins directly to Napoleonic innovations. The coordination of tanks, infantry, artillery and air power that characterizes contemporary warfare follows principles that Napoleon established with his integration of cavalry, infantry and artillery. The emphasis on speed, concentration and flexibility that defines modern military operations reflects lessons learned from studying Napoleonic campaigns. Even in the age of precision-guided munitions and satellite communications, military planners still grapple with the fundamental questions of concentration versus dispersion, offensive versus defensive action, and the relationship between military means and political ends that Napoleon explored 2 centuries ago. The core system innovation deserves particular attention as perhaps Napoleon's most enduring organizational contribution to military science. Before Napoleon, armies were typically organized as single large formations with little internal structure beyond the division between infantry, cavalry and artillery. This organization worked adequately for the limited campaigns of the 18th century, but proved inadequate for the sustained, far-ranging operations that characterized Napoleonic warfare. The core system solved this problem by creating semi-independent, combined arms formations that could operate separately while remaining coordinated with the overall army. Each Napoleonic corps typically contained between 20 and 30,000 men, organized into 2 or 3 infantry divisions, a cavalry brigade, an artillery reserve and supporting services, including engineers, medical personnel and supply trains. This organization gave each corps the capability to fight independently for extended periods while awaiting support from other corps or the main army. The flexibility this provided was revolutionary, allowing Napoleon to spread his forces across wide areas during approach marches while maintaining the ability to concentrate rapidly for battle. The comparison with previous military organization reveals the revolutionary nature of this innovation. Traditional armies moved as single entities, requiring elaborate supply trains and vulnerable lines of communication that limited their speed and operational flexibility. The core system allowed armies to live off the land more effectively while reducing their logistical footprint and increasing their speed of movement. This organizational change was as important as any tactical innovation in enabling the rapid, decisive campaigns that characterized Napoleonic warfare. Other European armies quickly recognized the advantages of the core system and adopted similar organizational structures. The Prussian army that defeated Napoleon at Leipzig and Waterloo was organized along corps lines, learned from studying French methods. The Austrian and Russian armies similarly adopted corps organization as they learned from their defeats at Napoleon's hands. By 1815, every major European army had adopted some version of the core system, demonstrating the universal applicability of this organizational innovation. Modern military organizational parallels to the Napoleonic core system are evident in contemporary army structures worldwide. Modern divisions and brigades perform similar functions to Napoleonic corps, providing combined arms capability at multiple organizational levels. The principle of creating self-sufficient tactical formations that can operate independently while supporting larger strategic objectives remains fundamental to military organization. Even in an age of satellite communications and precision weapons, the basic organizational insights that Napoleon pioneered continue to influence how armies are structured and employed. Chapter 16. Political and Administrative Genius. The genius of Napoleon Bonaparte extended far beyond the smoking battlefields where he earned his fame, reaching into the quiet halls of government where he revolutionized the very foundations of modern administration, law and civil society. While historians often focus on his military achievements, Napoleon's lasting impact on the world came through his extraordinary ability to transform not just how wars were fought, but how societies were governed, how laws were written, and how citizens related to their governments. His administrative and political innovations proved more durable than his military conquests, shaping the modern world in ways that continue to influence our daily lives more than 2 centuries after his death. When Napoleon seized power in the coup of 18 Brumaire in 1799, France lay exhausted and fragmented after a decade of revolutionary upheaval. The country that had proclaimed the rights of man and citizen had descended into chaos, with competing factions terrorizing each other while foreign enemies pressed against the nation's borders. The economy stagnated, the legal system remained in confusion, and French society seemed to be tearing itself apart. Into this maelstrom stepped the young general who had conquered Italy and Egypt, bringing with him not just military genius, but an extraordinary vision of how a modern state should function. The creation of the Napoleonic Code stands as perhaps the most significant legal achievement in human history, a revolutionary document that fundamentally changed how societies organize their laws and govern their citizens. Before Napoleon, French law was a confusing patchwork of ancient customs, royal decrees, and revolutionary legislation that often contradicted each other and varied from region to region. Northern France followed different legal traditions than the south, making commerce and administration needlessly complicated while creating opportunities for corruption and injustice. Napoleon recognized that a modern state required a unified legal system that would treat all citizens equally regardless of their location or social status. The process of creating the Civil Code consumed years of intense work by France's most brilliant legal minds, but Napoleon himself participated actively in the discussions, attending more than half of the 102 sessions of the Council of State where the code was debated and refined. His practical mind and broad experience helped shape a legal document that balanced abstract principles with practical application, creating laws that ordinary citizens could understand and courts could apply consistently. The Code established the equality of all men before the law, protected property rights, and created a framework for civil relations that emphasized individual responsibility and social order. The revolutionary impact of the Napoleonic Code extended far beyond France's borders, eventually influencing legal systems throughout the world. As Napoleon's armies carried the code across Europe, occupied territories experienced the benefits of rational, uniform legal administration for the first time. Even after Napoleon's defeat, many regions retained the legal principles he had introduced because they proved superior to the confused legal traditions they replaced. Today, legal systems based on Napoleonic principles govern more than half the world's population. From the civil law traditions of continental Europe to the legal frameworks of Latin America, parts of Africa, and much of Asia. The educational revolution that Napoleon initiated proved equally transformative, creating the foundations of modern educational systems that emphasized merit over birth and practical knowledge over aristocratic accomplishments. Before Napoleon, education in France was primarily the province of the Catholic Church and private tutors who served the wealthy elite. The revolutionary government had proclaimed the principle of universal education, but lacked the resources and organization to make it reality. Napoleon transformed these good intentions into concrete institutions that would educate French citizens for centuries to come. The system of lycées that Napoleon established created rigorous secondary schools that prepared students for careers in government, military service, and the professions. These schools emphasized mathematics, science, and modern languages rather than the classical education that had dominated aristocratic learning. Students were selected based on ability rather than social position, and the most talented graduates could compete for admission to the specialized schools that would train France's future leaders. This meritocratic approach to education revolutionized French society by creating opportunities for advancement based on talent and effort rather than inherited privilege. The administrative efficiency that Napoleon brought to the French government established principles of centralized administration that influenced governmental organization worldwide. The prefectural system he created placed appointed officials responsible to the central government in charge of each department, replacing the confused and often corrupt local administrations that had characterized the old regime. These prefects were selected based on ability and loyalty rather than local connections, and they were held accountable for the administration of their regions through regular reports and inspections. This centralized system enabled rapid and uniform implementation of government policies across the entire nation, while maintaining detailed knowledge of local conditions and needs. The prefects served as the eyes and ears of the central government, while also representing the interests of their regions in national decision-making. This balance between central control and local knowledge became a model for administrative organization that was adopted throughout Europe and eventually spread to colonial administrations around the world. Napoleon's approach to religious reconciliation demonstrated his understanding that political stability required social harmony, and that governments could not ignore the spiritual needs of their citizens. The Concordat he negotiated with Pope Pius VII in 1801 ended the bitter conflict between the French government and the Catholic Church that had poisoned French politics since the beginning of the Revolution. This agreement recognized Catholicism as the religion of the majority of French citizens while maintaining the principle of religious freedom and the secular nature of the state. The economic policies that Napoleon implemented revealed his sophisticated understanding of how military power and economic strength reinforced each other in the modern world. The Continental System represented one of history's first attempts at economic warfare on a continental scale, seeking to use France's military dominance to exclude British goods from European markets and thereby force Britain to make peace. Though ultimately unsuccessful due to the difficulty of enforcing such a comprehensive blockade, the Continental System demonstrated how economic and military strategies could be integrated to achieve political objectives. Napoleon's domestic economic policies proved more successful and lasting than his attempt to economically isolate Britain. He stabilized the French currency by creating the Bank of France and establishing the franc as a reliable medium of exchange, backed by precious metals. His government invested heavily in infrastructure projects that improved transportation and communication throughout France, building roads, canals and bridges that facilitated commerce and administration. These public works projects not only improved economic efficiency, but also provided employment during economic downturns, demonstrating an early understanding of how government spending could stimulate economic activity. The encouragement of industrial development that Napoleon provided helped transform France from a primarily agricultural economy into a modern industrial state. He offered prizes for technological innovations, protected French industries from foreign competition when necessary, and invested government resources in projects that promised economic benefits. His Continental System, despite its ultimate failure as a weapon against Britain, had the unintended consequence of forcing French manufacturers to develop domestic alternatives to British products, accelerating French industrial development. Napoleon's diplomatic innovations transformed international relations by demonstrating how military success could be leveraged to achieve lasting political changes. His manipulation of the balance of power in Europe showed how a skillful diplomatic strategist could use military victories to create new political arrangements that served long-term strategic interests. Rather than simply defeating his enemies and dictating peace terms, Napoleon sought to create stable political arrangements that would prevent future conflicts while securing France's dominant position. The creation and management of client states represented one of Napoleon's most sophisticated political innovations. Rather than annexing conquered territories directly to France, he often established satellite kingdoms ruled by members of his family or trusted subordinates. These client states provided military and economic support to France while maintaining sufficient autonomy to reduce administrative burdens and local resistance. The Kingdom of Italy, the Confederation of the Rhine, and the Kingdom of Westphalia all demonstrated how military conquest could be transformed into lasting political influence through skillful state-building. Marriage diplomacy became another tool in Napoleon's political arsenal, as he used dynastic connections to strengthen political alliances and legitimize his position in European politics. His marriage to Marie-Louise of Austria transformed the relationship between France and Austria from bitter enmity to reluctant cooperation, while marriages between members of the Bonaparte family and European royalty created networks of dynastic interest that supported French policy objectives. This approach to diplomacy recognized that personal relationships between rulers remained important in international politics despite the revolutionary changes of the age. The propaganda and public opinion management techniques that Napoleon pioneered anticipated modern approaches to political communication. He understood that military victories and good government policies were insufficient if citizens remained unaware of their government's achievements or hostile to its objectives. The Moniteur and other official publications spread news of French successes while minimizing setbacks, creating a favorable public impression of Napoleonic rule. This attention to public opinion represented an early recognition that governments in the modern age required popular support to achieve their objectives effectively. Napoleon's cultural patronage revealed his understanding that political power required cultural legitimacy, and that great states needed to excel in arts and sciences as well as warfare and administration. His support for neoclassical art and architecture created a distinctive Napoleonic style that associated his regime with the grandeur of ancient Rome, while demonstrating France's cultural sophistication. The Arc de Triomphe, the Vendôme column, and numerous other monuments created during his reign transformed Paris into a showcase of imperial grandeur that impressed foreign visitors and inspired French pride. The scientific expeditions that Napoleon supported, most notably his expedition to Egypt, demonstrated his recognition that knowledge and exploration enhanced national prestige while providing practical benefits. The scholars who accompanied his Egyptian campaign made discoveries that advanced human understanding of ancient civilizations while the detailed maps and surveys they produced provided valuable intelligence for future military and commercial activities. This integration of scientific research with military and political objectives became a model for later governmental support of exploration and research. Cultural nationalism became another tool in Napoleon's political arsenal as he encouraged the development of distinctive French cultural identity while respecting local traditions in conquered territories. He promoted French language and culture throughout his empire, while generally allowing subject peoples to maintain their own customs and traditions so long as they did not conflict with French political objectives. This approach helped create loyalty to the Napoleonic system, while avoiding the bitter resistance that often accompanied more heavy-handed cultural impositions. The educational and intellectual development that Napoleon fostered created lasting changes in European thought and culture that extended far beyond his political control. The emphasis on rational scientific thinking that characterized Napoleonic education influenced generations of European intellectuals and political leaders. The competitive examinations and merit-based advancement that he instituted became models for governmental and educational institutions throughout the world. The global influence of the Napoleonic Code deserves particular examination as the most enduring of Napoleon's innovations. The legal principles embedded in the Civil Code spread throughout the world, not just through French conquest, but through voluntary adoption by societies that recognized the superiority of its approach to civil law. The Code's emphasis on written law rather than judicial precedent, its protection of property rights, and its establishment of legal equality created a framework for modern legal systems that proved adaptable to widely different social and political conditions. Modern legal systems using Napoleonic foundations can be found throughout continental Europe, Latin America, much of Africa, and parts of Asia. These systems share common approaches to contract law, property rights, and civil procedures that facilitate international commerce and legal cooperation. The influence of Napoleonic legal principles extends even to countries that follow different legal traditions, as concepts first articulated in the Civil Code have been incorporated into legal systems worldwide. The comparison between Napoleonic civil law tradition and Anglo-Saxon common law reveals fundamental differences in legal philosophy that continue to influence how different societies organize their legal systems. Common law systems rely heavily on judicial precedent and case-by-case development of legal principles, while civil law systems emphasize comprehensive written codes that provide clear rules for most legal situations. Both approaches have advantages and disadvantages, but the Napoleonic approach has proven particularly attractive to societies seeking to modernize their legal systems rapidly and comprehensively. The social and political implications of civil law codes extend beyond legal technicalities to influence how societies understand the relationship between individuals and the state. The Napoleonic tradition emphasizes the role of the state in protecting individual rights and providing a framework for social order, while also recognizing the importance of individual responsibility and private property. This balance between individual freedom and social order has proven attractive to societies seeking to combine democratic governance with effective administration, making Napoleonic legal principles relevant to contemporary discussions of governmental organization and individual rights. Through his administrative and political innovations, Napoleon demonstrated that military genius alone was insufficient to create lasting change in the modern world. His recognition that effective government required rational legal systems, merit-based administration, and attention to economic development provided a model for state building that influenced political development worldwide. The institutions he created in France survived his military defeats and continued to shape French society long after his death, while his innovations spread throughout the world as other societies adopted the principles he had pioneered. The genius of Napoleon Bonaparte lay not just in his ability to win battles or conquer territories, but in his extraordinary capacity to envision and create the institutions that would govern modern society. His legal, educational and administrative innovations proved more durable than his military conquests, creating foundations for modern government that continue to influence our world today. In transforming how laws were written, how governments were organized, and how societies educated their citizens, Napoleon left a legacy that extends far beyond the battlefield to touch virtually every aspect of contemporary life. Chapter 17. The Human Napoleon, Psychology of Genius and Power. Behind the legend of Napoleon Bonaparte stood a man of extraordinary complexity, whose personality combined brilliant intellect with deep emotional needs, strategic genius with personal vulnerability, and revolutionary ideals with imperial ambitions. To understand his military genius fully, we must examine the human being who possessed it, for Napoleon's character shaped every aspect of his leadership and ultimately determined both his greatest triumphs and his final downfall. Napoleon's charismatic leadership emerged from a unique combination of intellectual brilliance and emotional intelligence that allowed him to inspire fierce loyalty among his soldiers and subordinates. Unlike many military commanders who remained distant from their troops, Napoleon possessed an almost magnetic personal presence that drew people to him. He had an extraordinary memory for faces and names, remembering soldiers he had met years earlier and asking about their families and homes. This personal touch created an emotional bond between Napoleon and his army that transcended mere military discipline. When he walked among his troops before battle, calling them mes enfants, or my children, grown men would weep with emotion and pledge to die for him. His ability to make each person feel personally important and valued created a devotion that sustained his armies through the harshest campaigns. This charismatic quality extended beyond the military sphere into his political and diplomatic relationships. Foreign diplomats often arrived determined to resist his influence, but found themselves charmed by his intelligence, wit, and apparent sincerity. He could adapt his personality to his audience, appearing as the revolutionary hero to republicans, the legitimate ruler to monarchists, or the practical administrator to bureaucrats. His physical presence, though not imposing in stature at 5 feet 7 inches, radiated energy and intensity that commanded attention. His piercing grey eyes seemed to penetrate to the heart of whatever matter he was considering, and his rapid, animated gestures reflected the speed of his thinking. Napoleon's work ethic bordered on the superhuman, reflecting both his intellectual curiosity and his driving ambition. He typically worked 18 to 20 hours per day, dictating correspondence, studying maps, reviewing reports, and planning operations simultaneously. His secretaries worked in shifts to keep up with his pace, and he would often dictate multiple letters on different subjects to different scribes at the same time. This extraordinary capacity for work allowed him to maintain personal control over an empire spanning from Spain to Poland, but it also revealed his difficulty in trusting others with important decisions. He read voraciously, consuming books on history, literature, science and philosophy, even during military campaigns. His travelling library contained hundreds of volumes, and he would often be found reading by candlelight in his tent after a full day of marching and fighting. His intellectual curiosity extended far beyond military matters. Napoleon maintained correspondence with leading scientists of his day, founded the Egyptian Institute during his Egyptian campaign, and brought scholars and scientists on his military expeditions. He asked penetrating questions about everything from engineering problems to astronomical observations, always seeking to understand the underlying principles behind what he observed. This scientific approach to knowledge influenced his military thinking, leading him to analyze warfare with the same systematic methodology that natural philosophers applied to their investigations. Yet beneath this brilliant exterior lay deep emotional needs and personal struggles that profoundly influenced his behavior. Napoleon craved love and affection with an intensity that sometimes overwhelmed those around him. His passionate nature, which served him well in inspiring troops and driving his ambitions, also made him vulnerable to emotional manipulation and led to impulsive decisions that contradicted his usual strategic calculation. He formed intense friendships and equally intense enmities, often based more on personal loyalty than political considerations. His relationship with his subordinates combined paternal affection with demanding expectations, creating bonds of loyalty that lasted even through defeat and exile. Napoleon's marriage to Josephine de Beauharnais revealed both his capacity for deep love and his struggle to balance personal desires with political necessities. Their relationship began as a passionate romance that saw the young general writing love letters of almost embarrassing intensity while campaigning in Italy. Josephine, 6 years older and already the mother of 2 children from her first marriage, initially viewed Napoleon more as a useful connection than a romantic partner. However, their relationship evolved into a complex partnership that combined genuine affection with political calculation. Josephine's social skills and connections in Parisian society complemented Napoleon's military genius and political ambition, helping to establish his legitimacy among the French elite. The couple's inability to produce an heir created a source of increasing tension that ultimately led to their divorce in 1809. Napoleon's decision to end their marriage demonstrated the painful conflict between his personal feelings and his imperial responsibilities. He wept openly during the divorce ceremony, yet he understood that his dynasty's survival required a legitimate heir. His subsequent marriage to Marie-Louise of Austria, 18 years his junior and daughter of his former enemy, represented pure political calculation designed to cement his position among European royalty and produce the succession he desperately needed. Napoleon's relationship with his family revealed another dimension of his complex personality. He elevated his siblings to thrones across Europe, creating what critics called the Napoleon dynasty. However, his brothers and sisters often proved unreliable allies, pursuing their own interests rather than supporting his broader strategy. His relationship with his mother, Letizia Ramolino Bonaparte, remained strong throughout his life, and her practical wisdom and emotional support provided stability during his most difficult periods. She alone seemed able to speak frankly to him about his mistakes and limitations, offering the kind of honest counsel that his position made difficult to obtain elsewhere. His leadership style combined meticulous attention to detail with an ability to see the broader strategic picture that few commanders have ever matched. Napoleon involved himself in every aspect of military organization, from the design of uniforms to the specifications for artillery pieces. He personally reviewed reports on troop strengths, supply situations, and morale assessments, maintaining a comprehensive understanding of his army's capabilities and limitations. This micromanagement approach allowed him to make informed decisions quickly, but it also created a system dependent on his personal involvement that struggled to function effectively in his absence. Despite his tendency toward micromanagement, Napoleon demonstrated remarkable skill in selecting and utilizing capable subordinates. He promoted officers based on merit rather than birth, creating a generation of talented commanders who shared his commitment to excellence and innovation. Marshals like Davout, Massena and Lannes became extensions of his strategic vision, capable of independent action while remaining aligned with his overall objectives. His ability to delegate authority when necessary while maintaining strategic control allowed him to conduct complex operations across multiple theatres simultaneously. Napoleon's decision-making under pressure revealed both his greatest strengths and his most dangerous weaknesses. In crisis situations, his mind seemed to operate with superhuman clarity, analyzing complex problems and identifying solutions that escaped others entirely. The speed and accuracy of his tactical decisions during battle became legendary, often turning apparently hopeless situations into victories through unexpected maneuvers or brilliant timing. However, this same confidence in his judgment sometimes led him to dismiss warnings or advice that might have prevented strategic errors. His belief in his own infallibility, reinforced by years of success, gradually undermined his ability to acknowledge mistakes or adapt to changing circumstances. His risk-taking propensity evolved throughout his career, beginning with calculated gambles based on careful analysis and gradually becoming more reckless as his power and confidence grew. Early in his military career, Napoleon's risks were typically supported by thorough preparation and multiple contingency plans. His crossing of the Alps during the Italian campaign exemplified this approach, combining audacious strategic vision with meticulous logistical planning. However, later campaigns like the invasion of Russia revealed a troubling tendency to assume that willpower and tactical brilliance could overcome strategic impossibilities. Napoleon's intellectual interests extended far beyond military matters, reflecting a Renaissance-style curiosity about all aspects of human knowledge. His personal library, which travelled with him on campaigns and eventually grew to contain over 40,000 volumes, revealed the breadth of his interests and the depth of his learning. He read classical historians like Plutarch and Tacitus, seeking to understand how great leaders of the past had handled similar challenges. Ancient military treatises, particularly those dealing with tactics and strategy, provided inspiration for his own innovations. However, he also studied contemporary works on science, philosophy and literature, maintaining correspondence with leading intellectuals of his time. His reading habits demonstrated both systematic study and voracious appetite for knowledge. Napoleon would often read while eating, walking or travelling, maximizing every available moment for learning. He made extensive notes in the margins of his books, developing his own interpretations and applications of the ideas he encountered. His secretaries maintained detailed catalogues of his library, organized by subject and annotated with his personal comments and evaluations. This systematic approach to learning influenced his military thinking, encouraging him to view warfare as a science that could be studied, understood, and mastered through rigorous intellectual effort. Classical authors profoundly influenced Napoleon's conception of leadership and his understanding of historical precedent. He identified strongly with figures like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, seeing himself as their natural successor in the tradition of great conquerors. However, his reading went beyond simple hero worship to include careful analysis of how these leaders had achieved their successes and what lessons their experiences offered for contemporary application. His study of Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic Wars influenced his own approach to military logistics and his understanding of how to maintain army morale during extended campaigns. The evolution of Napoleon's political and philosophical views reflected both his intellectual development and his changing circumstances. Early in his career, influenced by Enlightenment ideals and revolutionary fervour, he genuinely believed in creating a more rational and egalitarian society. His legal reforms, particularly the Napoleonic Code, demonstrated his commitment to principles of equality before the law and merit-based advancement. However, as his power grew, his views evolved toward a more pragmatic acceptance of authoritarian methods as necessary for achieving his broader objectives. His religious views underwent similar evolution, moving from the skepticism of his youth toward a more pragmatic appreciation of religion's social utility. Napoleon's famous statement that "religion is what keeps the poor from murdering the rich" reflected his mature understanding of how belief systems could serve political stability. His concordat with the Catholic Church demonstrated his ability to balance personal skepticism with political necessity, recognizing that French society required religious reconciliation to achieve lasting peace. Napoleon's scientific curiosity manifested itself in his patronage of research and exploration, his personal interest in technological innovation, and his systematic approach to problem-solving. During the Egyptian campaign, he brought a team of scholars and scientists whose research laid the foundation for modern Egyptology. His establishment of the metric system, his support for vaccination programs, and his investment in infrastructure projects reflected his belief that scientific progress could improve human welfare and strengthen the state. This scientific approach influenced his military thinking, leading him to view warfare as a field where systematic study and technological innovation could provide decisive advantages. Chapter 18. Historical Assessment and Modern Perspectives. Napoleon Bonaparte's place in history remains a subject of intense debate among scholars, with assessments ranging from celebration of his genius to condemnation of his destructive ambition. Modern historical analysis has moved beyond simple hero worship or demonization to examine the complex legacy of a figure who fundamentally transformed European civilization while leaving a trail of unprecedented destruction in his wake. Understanding Napoleon's true historical significance requires careful examination of his military innovations, political reforms, social impact, and the long-term consequences of his actions across multiple dimensions of human experience. Among military historians, Napoleon consistently ranks among the greatest commanders in human history, typically mentioned alongside Alexander the Great, Hannibal and Caesar as practitioners of warfare at its highest level. His tactical innovations revolutionized battlefield operations, introducing flexible corps organization that allowed rapid concentration of force at decisive points while maintaining strategic mobility across extended theaters. The speed and coordination of his campaigns became legendary, with armies moving faster and striking harder than anything previously seen in European warfare. His ability to defeat coalition after coalition of experienced opponents demonstrated mastery of operational art that few commanders have ever approached. However, modern analysis has revealed the limitations of his strategic vision, particularly his tendency toward overextension and his failure to develop sustainable political solutions for his conquests. While his tactical brilliance won individual battles and campaigns, his broader strategic objectives often proved impossible to achieve through military means alone. The invasion of Russia exemplified this disconnect between tactical capability and strategic reality, where his army's operational excellence could not overcome the fundamental impossibility of permanently occupying such vast territories with hostile populations. Napoleon's military innovations permanently changed the nature of warfare, introducing concepts and methods that remained relevant well into the 20th century. His emphasis on concentrated firepower, rapid movement, and flexible organization influenced military thinking throughout the industrial age. The Prussian military reforms following their defeats by Napoleon incorporated many of his innovations, creating the German staff system that dominated European warfare until 1945. His integration of artillery, infantry, and cavalry into coordinated combined arms operations became the foundation for modern military doctrine. The establishment of military academies and systematic officer training programs reflected his understanding that professional competence, rather than aristocratic birth, should determine military leadership. This meritocratic approach created opportunities for talented individuals regardless of social background, revolutionizing military institutions across Europe. His emphasis on studying military history and learning from past campaigns established the intellectual framework for modern military education. Napoleon's political legacy presents a fascinating paradox between democratic ideals and authoritarian practice that continues to influence contemporary political discourse. His rise to power initially appeared to fulfill the French Revolution's promise of careers open to talent and government based on merit rather than birth. The Napoleonic Code established legal principles of equality before the law that influenced legal systems worldwide, while his administrative reforms created efficient government institutions that survived long after his fall. Yet his concentration of power in his own hands, his suppression of press freedom, and his establishment of a hereditary empire contradicted the revolutionary principles he claimed to represent. Modern scholars debate whether Napoleon represented the revolution's fulfillment or its betrayal, with evidence supporting both interpretations. His ability to maintain popular support while restricting political freedoms demonstrated the complex relationship between democratic legitimacy and authoritarian governance that continues to challenge political theorists. His vision of European integration under French leadership prefigured later attempts at continental unification, though his methods relied on military conquest rather than voluntary cooperation. The Continental System attempted to create an integrated European economy that would exclude British influence, anticipating modern concepts of economic union while failing to account for the political prerequisites necessary for such cooperation. His legal and administrative reforms created common standards across much of Europe, facilitating later integration efforts while establishing precedents for supranational governance. The economic and social impact of the Napoleonic period fundamentally transformed European society, accelerating the transition from traditional feudal structures toward modern capitalist economies. His abolition of serfdom in conquered territories, his promotion of merit-based advancement, and his destruction of aristocratic privileges created opportunities for middle-class advancement that permanently altered European social structures. The infrastructure projects undertaken during his reign, including roads, canals, and public buildings, provided the foundation for later industrial development. However, the human cost of his wars was enormous, with estimates suggesting that 5 to 6 million people died in the conflicts between 1803 and 1815. Entire regions were devastated by repeated campaigns, and the demographic impact of military casualties affected European population patterns for generations. The economic disruption caused by constant warfare and the Continental System created hardship for millions of civilians whose livelihoods depended on international trade. Napoleon's modernization efforts introduced new technologies and administrative methods that accelerated social and economic development, but these benefits came at tremendous cost in human suffering. The question of whether his achievements justified their price remains central to historical assessment of his legacy. Modern scholarship tends to emphasize the complexity of this calculation, recognizing both the transformative benefits and the destructive consequences of his actions. Contemporary historical interpretation has moved beyond the traditional focus on great men and political events to examine the broader social, cultural, and economic forces that shaped the Napoleonic period. New research methods, including quantitative analysis of demographic data and digital mapping of campaign movements, have provided fresh insights into aspects of Napoleon's impact that previous generations of historians could not adequately examine. Psychological analysis has offered new perspectives on Napoleon's personality and decision-making processes, drawing on modern understanding of leadership psychology and the effects of power on individual behavior. These studies have revealed the complex interplay between his intellectual brilliance and emotional needs, helping to explain both his extraordinary achievements and his ultimate failures. Comparative studies with other historical figures have placed his career in broader context, identifying patterns of authoritarian leadership that transcend specific historical periods. The revival of interest in military history following 20th-century conflicts has led to more sophisticated analysis of Napoleon's tactical and strategic methods. Modern military historians, drawing on their understanding of mechanized warfare and global strategy, have gained new appreciation for both the innovations and limitations of Napoleonic military practice. This research has influenced contemporary military doctrine while providing insights into the relationship between technological capability and strategic success. Napoleon's representation in popular culture reflects changing attitudes toward authority, nationalism, and individual achievement that mirror broader cultural developments. In the 19th century, he was typically portrayed either as a romantic hero, embodying individual will, triumphing over circumstances, or as a cautionary example of ambition leading to destruction. 20th century interpretations reflected contemporary concerns about totalitarian leadership and the dangers of concentrated power. Modern popular culture tends to present more nuanced portraits that acknowledge both his achievements and his flaws, reflecting contemporary skepticism about simple heroic narratives. Films, novels, and other artistic works have explored different aspects of his personality and career, from his rise to power through his exile and death. These cultural representations have shaped public understanding of his legacy, often emphasizing dramatic personal elements while minimizing the broader historical context of his actions. Different national traditions have developed varying perspectives on Napoleon's significance, reflecting their own historical experiences and cultural values. French memory tends to emphasize his role in spreading revolutionary ideals and establishing France as a major European power, while German and Russian traditions focus more on his role as a foreign invader whose defeats contributed to their national development. British perspectives traditionally emphasized his threat to constitutional government and free trade, though recent scholarship has acknowledged his contributions to European development. The enduring fascination with Napoleon Bonaparte reflects universal themes that transcend specific historical circumstances and continue to resonate with contemporary audiences. His career illustrates the eternal tension between individual ambition and historical forces, raising questions about the extent to which exceptional individuals can shape the course of human events. His rise from obscure provincial origins to mastery of Europe embodies the dream of self-made success that remains central to modern cultural values. The relationship between his extraordinary abilities and ultimate failure provides insights into the limitations of individual genius when confronted with systemic constraints. His military innovations and administrative reforms demonstrated how individual creativity and determination can transform existing institutions and practices. However, his strategic overreach and political mistakes revealed the dangers of believing that individual will can overcome structural realities. His career offers valuable lessons for contemporary leaders in both public and private sectors. His systematic approach to problem-solving, his emphasis on merit-based selection, and his ability to inspire organizational loyalty remain relevant to modern management practice. His integration of detailed planning with flexible execution provides models for strategic thinking in complex, rapidly changing environments. However, his failures also offer important warnings about the dangers of excessive centralization, the need for accurate information in decision-making, and the importance of sustainable institutional development. His tendency toward micromanagement and his difficulty in accepting advice from subordinates illustrate common leadership problems that continue to affect contemporary organizations. Napoleon's significance extends beyond his individual achievements to encompass his role as a catalyst for broader historical transformations that shaped the modern world. His career marked the transition between the traditional European order based on aristocratic privilege and religious authority, and the modern system based on national identity and democratic legitimacy. While he did not create these changes single-handedly, his actions accelerated and amplified trends that were already emerging in European society. The legal and administrative systems he established provided frameworks for modern governmental institutions that influenced political development worldwide. The Napoleonic Code became a model for legal systems across Europe and in former European colonies, establishing principles of legal equality and systematic jurisprudence that remain influential today. His educational reforms and emphasis on technical training contributed to the development of modern professional classes and bureaucratic institutions. His impact on European nationalism proved particularly significant, as his conquests inadvertently stimulated the development of national consciousness among the peoples he defeated. The experience of foreign occupation and the exposure to French revolutionary ideals encouraged the growth of nationalist movements that eventually transformed the European political landscape. The unification of Germany and Italy in the 19th century can be traced partly to the disruption of traditional political structures during the Napoleonic period. Any final assessment of Napoleon's historical significance must acknowledge the complexity of his legacy and the impossibility of reaching simple judgments about his impact on human civilization. His extraordinary military genius and administrative innovations contributed to important advances in governmental efficiency, legal equality, and social mobility. His vision of European integration and his promotion of merit-based advancement anticipated important developments in modern society. However, these achievements came at enormous cost in human suffering and political freedom. The wars he initiated or prolonged caused unprecedented destruction and loss of life, while his authoritarian methods suppressed the very democratic ideals he claimed to represent. The question of whether his positive contributions justified these costs cannot be answered definitively, as it depends on value judgments about the relative importance of different aspects of human welfare and progress. Modern historical analysis suggests that Napoleon's career can best be understood as a product of specific historical circumstances that allowed an individual of exceptional ability to achieve extraordinary influence while revealing the limitations that constrain even the most gifted leaders. His successes demonstrated the potential for individual achievement within favourable historical conditions, while his failures illustrated the constraints imposed by geography, economics and human nature on even the most ambitious enterprises. The continuing relevance of Napoleon's career lies not in simple admiration or condemnation of his actions, but in understanding how his experiences illuminate enduring aspects of leadership, power, and historical change that remain relevant to contemporary challenges. His legacy serves as both inspiration and warning, demonstrating both the potential for individual achievement and the dangers of unchecked ambition in ways that continue to inform our understanding of leadership and governance in the modern world.